In an episode that covered double the amount of chapters that it usually does, it felt like we kinda got 2 episodes in one here. The first was the half that covered Cliff's proposal to Alina Lise, while the second was the epic showdown between Rudeus and Badigadi. With so much content being condensed into 23 minutes though, it's only natural that we miss out on a lot of the underlying context here. Things like why Cliff is even at this university to begin with, then the whole national crisis inherent to a demon king crossing into human territory. Given how different such stories are though, today we'll focus on Badigadi and how he got here, then the next video will be Cliff and more of the side story stuff. But first, if you're looking for an exciting new anime-styled adventure game, then allow me to introduce you to today's sponsor, Wuthering Waves. A cross-platform free-to-play open-world action RPG featuring fast and smooth combat gameplay with high degrees of freedom. In an unfamiliar world that follows the events of an apocalyptic invasion, you'll embark on this massive adventure to help save humanity from extinction. It's a vast open world you're free to explore, all while engaging any and all monsters in intense high-skill combat. It's also all completely free and fully available without spending a cent. The entire gaming experience is all there right from the get-go. Then if you want to play anytime, anywhere, you can seamlessly continue your adventure whether through the Epic Games Store on PC or even just your smartphone. It's fully cross-platform on PCs, smartphones, and tablets. So, if you want to explore the diverse new narrative of this post-apocalyptic adventure, or just take part in a fun open world with lots to discover, then I highly recommend registering for Wuthering Waves with my link in the description. It's a game I definitely plan on playing myself when it comes out. So, use my link to pre-register today and feel free to follow their social media to stay caught up on it. But now, let's get back to the video. Episode 32. The Fiancé of Despair, covering chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4 from volume 9 of the light novel. As I said in the intro, since the episode is distinctly split between Cliff's proposal and the whole Beastfolk mating season, for this video we'll focus solely on the latter chapters, the part of the story where Rudeus literally disintegrates a demon king. Half a year after Rudy had enrolled, we stumble across a period of time known as the harvest season. It wasn't a season that lasted very long, but for the short time it did, the events that occurred during were very important. One of which was of course the Beastfolk mating rituals. With only 5% of the student body actually being Beastfolk though, you wouldn't think 500 of them would become so prominent, yet it was once autumn came that you couldn't go 5 steps without seeing one. Reason being that, despite their small number, Beastfolk from around the world would gather and increase it tenfold. There were numerous students for which Beastfolk would travel far and wide to challenge here. Lots of ideal marriage candidates just like Linnea and Persena. The school wasn't necessarily fond of outsiders walking in whenever they wanted, but since the mating season was a very delicate subject inherent to the Beastfolk culture, to ban such a tradition would undoubtedly incite riots. It was a lot easier to just let those non-student Beastfolk in under the pretense of auditing classes. Of course, granted they asked for permission first. So, what does that have to do with the overall story? Well, with Linnea and Persena being these unattainable princesses, as well as the strongest Beastfolk fighters in the entire school, to beat them would make you a potential candidate to lead all the Doldia. There was a good chance that making them your mate would result in you being heavily considered to lead the tribe one day. That said, all this was something neither of them were concerned with. So normally any proposals would just be rejected outright, but it seems the more they resisted, the more suitors they attracted. It eventually got to the point where beastmen would ambush them and try to win their affection by force. Luckily, no one was ever strong enough, but the constant attacks were enough of a bother to make the two hold themselves up all season. They would much rather stay inside than deal with the hassle of it all. For everyone else who wasn't Beastfolk, additional caution was needed since many people liked to take advantage of all the chaos. So much so that the school had to deploy security patrols and ensure all duels were fully consensual. The general rule being that you couldn't attack someone who refused to fight you. Unfortunately, that didn't always work though, so for those who weren't quite skilled in self-defense, the professors insisted that they travel in groups. There were even times when some would be challenged under the precedent that it was just for practice. So, if any girls were to come up and try to do that to Rudeus, Fitz had told him to just ignore them. 9 times out of 10, they were likely just trying to trick him. In any case, this whole mating season thing was now a core part of the university's curriculum. It was an abrupt change to Rudy's otherwise peaceful student life. Where things start to pick up is that initial challenge from the Beastman we see here. It wasn't the challenger that was so much of interest to him though, but instead the female bystander standing next to him. Nothing was said of note other than a description of her appearance, but her sword was mentioned to be one commonly used by practitioners of the sword god style. Aside from that, she was simply there as a bystander to the other challenger. To Rudy, she was likely just a passerby. Now, Rudy had tried to reject the duel by saying he was late for piano practice, but just as we saw, this Adoldian was intent on fighting. Not only was he aware that Rudy had slain his stray worm solo, but Geas himself had told him just how exceptional Rudy was. To Brook, Rudy was the perfect opponent. Just as quickly as it was in the anime though, Rudy had trapped Brook with a sneaky quagmire, then immediately ended the duel with a single stone cannon. It was a fight that Rudy had essentially won on reflex. With 5 more challenges coming shortly after, Rudy had finally understood what Linnea and Prasenna meant with the letter they had sent. It seems more than a few people were infatuated by the fact that they were princesses, leaving Rudy no choice but to hole himself up in the library. Whether it was a university rule or an ancient beastfolk tradition, for some reason the beastfolk weren't so blunt as to challenge him here. So, as they waited in line outside, it was Rudy's discussion with Fitz that would lead him to take the initiative and finally fight them. To her, it was easier to just defeat them than wait for them to leave. She didn't even think he'd need any help, despite aid from the student council being a valid option for him. So, it was when Rudy did finally accept his fate that he would come across a single challenger rather than the multiple he was expecting. An immortal demon king that went by the name of Badigadi. If you're wondering how Badigadi got here, well, that's a whole side story from part of the epilogue of last volume. You see, it was 3 months prior to this very encounter that we find ourselves in a small bit of land called Ogre Island. A place inhabited solely by the Ogre tribe and led by a strong warrior that's often referred to as the Ogre God. Technically, these ogres are part of the demon race, but since they never fought in the Laplace War or even the Great Human Demon War, they were never fully ingrained as part of it. Instead, the ogres became considered a race of their own, much like how we consider the dwarves and elves as such. Since these ogres liked to keep to themselves though, it was very rare for anyone to even know of their existence. Their only friendly relation was with the Beharul kingdom just west of them, and any person unlucky enough to stumble into their territory was immediately attacked and subsequently killed. That usually was the way visitors were treated, but it wasn't until a mysterious man had arrived by ship that his curiosity would surpass even their reclusive nature. At first, the ogres did put up a little bit of a fuss, but after a bit of time this man was eventually welcomed as their guest. He would settle down and become their friend, and even train their youth and befriend the ogre god. It was a comfortable way of living that would last for around 2 years or so. That may seem long to us, but for a man who'd lived for over thousands, such a period was actually quite brief for him, especially with the arrival of a certain letter making his departure immediate. What this letter was a response from an S-ranked adventurer with whom he'd issued an urgent request to. She had apparently found the person he'd been looking for all the way back before he'd even arrived at Ogre Island. So, once that message was made clear, this man knew that he'd have to leave immediately. Human lives were far too short to get caught up enjoying his stay too long. That's just how brief several decades were to him. So, after a grand banquet held by the ogres, this man who had made himself a guest would be sent off by the solitary tribe that had welcomed him. He was this immortal man that once fought with the ogre god only to lose, reviving the next day only to lose once more. Then, after repeating this cycle over and over, well, let's just say that those 2 years weren't quite long enough. It's a story about Badigadi that was briefly shown in the end credits for episode 4. Now, the journey this demon king took next takes us all the way to the west to the farthest ends of the northern territories. It was along his journey there, though, that every country he would cross through would treat him a little bit differently. One would see his arrival as an invasion, while another would attempt to appease him by offering sacrifices. Regardless of what it was, this immortal demon would continue forward without any hesitation. He would ignore any and all attempts to stop him and continue west in a straight line just like the Juggernaut from X-Men. Then, by the time a country would even realize he was there, he would already be gone and into the next. There was no stopping Badigadi until he got to Renoa. It was once he finally did get there that the word of his approach would bring about panic and confusion. You see, normally such news would be passed far faster than the Demon King's arrival, but by the time the higher-ups heard that he was coming, Badigadi had already crossed into their territory. It was a sudden invasion that they were neither prepared for nor expecting. Part of the reason why it was such a surprise was mainly because Demon Kings never ventured off the Demon Continent anymore. Sure, in the past there were several warlike aggressive ones who were always invading, but after the Laplace War all those hundreds of years ago, most, if not all, were completely exterminated. The only demon kings that remained now were the ones that were peaceful or cautious by nature. They were the ones that ruled the demon continent in peace. That's not to say that they were weak though, because each of these kings were more than strong enough to conquer parts of the demon continent single-handedly. So if just one got up and decided to attack the humans one day, the amount of damage they could do would be unfathomable. That being the case, it was only natural the northern territories tried to intercept him, not only by dispatching every single one of their knights, but by also requesting emergency assistance from the Adventurers Guild. It was a massive force that unfortunately was still quite a ways away from the university. A mini garrison was positioned around campus, but with that being only local adventurers, members of the Magic Guild, and small units of soldiers, at best they could only hope to slow down Badigadi. It was an order that would only be given if the situation seemed necessary. Until then, the garrison was ordered to wait for the main forces. Now, from the perspective of those being invaded, the Demon King's purpose could have been anything. There was no telling what he wanted or who he was after. All they knew was that now he was here in the university. As for who it was they were facing, well, since there was only one Demon King with 6 arms and that color skin, everyone immediately knew it was Badigadi the Immortal, the ancient king whose power was literal indestructibility. He was a demon that lived since before the Laplace War and was even thought to have fought against the demon god himself and survived. Since he was typically peaceful by nature though, no one ever knew what his full capabilities were. All they knew for certain was that he could survive literally anything. So, why was this Demon King here now? Well, the only thing we know is that he was here for Rudeus, bringing us now back to when Rudy would be staring him down in the school's courtyard. Rudy had started to feel a bit more powerful lately, but considering the giant tank standing in front of him, he felt this was probably the universe setting him straight again. So it was as he was waiting for his staff that the principal George would run from the crowd and tell Rudy that reinforcements were coming. All they needed was for Rudy to buy them a little bit more time. This wasn't something included in the anime because if they did, then they would have to include everything that preceded it. They would need to explain why it is Badigadi being here was such a crisis for them. So, as one of the more major bits of cut content, we're missing a whole layer of context which would have made the situation a lot more tense. The entire nation was supposed to be in a state of panic, and the school was supposed to be doing everything they could to delay Badigadi from going any further. They had even gone so far as to hold Fitz back from delivering Rudy's staff to him. If they could prevent him from receiving his staff, then to them they felt that they could delay the duel forever. That was the reason Fitz had taken so long to deliver it to him. It wasn't until Zaniba stepped in to help Fitz that she was finally able to break free and get to him. Yet another bit of cut content showing just how chaotic the situation was. In any case, an interesting thing to note from right before the duel is that Rudy had actually tried to activate his Eye of Foresight. He wanted to see if there was any particular attack Badigadi was going to lead into first. What he saw instead, though, was absolutely nothing, as the Demon King standing there was no longer visible to him. Apparently, demon eyes didn't work on him. Another important bit of context was the brief back and forth the two had right after Rudy had mentioned Orsted. First, Badigadi wanted to know if it really was Orsted, then after that he asked Rudy if he was able to injure him. It was only after Rudy had answered yes that Badigadi would straighten up and proceed to the request we saw. He wanted Rudy to hit him with his best, perhaps even the same spell he used against Orsted. The reasoning wasn't quite clear, but given that he was curious on whether Rudy was able to injure Orsted or not, perhaps Badigadi wanted to see whose battle aura was stronger. When it came to the attack itself, the most important component out of this 3-step process was actually the amount of mana put into the velocity. If nothing else, this was the part Rudy would devote the most mana into. Considering the time he had to focus on all 3 though, Rudy was hoping he would at least be able to scratch the Demon King. So you can imagine his surprise when he literally obliterated him. The moment the stone cannon reached his body, everything above the waist and arms were all instantly disintegrated. They had immediately disappeared as if not even there to begin with. It was an odd sight made even more peculiar by the fact that there wasn't blood. Perhaps an indication that that was just how things worked with the Demon King. Regardless, with that the battle was over and Rudy the victor. Had the two fought for real, then Badigadi was certain the entire campus would be reduced to rubble. So to him it was wise for Rudy to have chosen this type of battle. It was after Rudy was knocked out for winning that Badigadi would then go and willingly discuss things with the principal. It was them, the leader of the Magic Guild and the captain of the Magic Knights, who would work things out to eventually make him a student here. That entire process took about a month, but it was after all that he would come to stick around for a bit. In the meantime, Rudy would do more slice of life stuff with Fitz and his classmates. Minor things that I'll mention in the next episode. But yeah, that's pretty much it for this cut content. We're only halfway through, but I'm curious to know what you guys thought of the episode. Do you think it seemed rushed, or did you feel it did alright? And do you think it would have benefited from that extra layer of context with Badigadi? Those implications of what it meant for him to be there? Let me know what you think down in the comments. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!